If you ever get the feeling that you're doing everything right on your controller or your keyboard and mouse, but your enemies are still able to react to things faster than you and your system isn't responding to you quick enough, then this is the video for you. I've put together a no-nonsense guide that's updated for Season 1 Reloaded and beyond, so it's changed a little bit compared to the original Season 1 and launch stuff for the best possible settings for Modern Warfare 2, Warzone, DMZ, etc. heading into 2023. We're going to absolutely crush input lag and make sure that your visibility is as good as possible so that you're the one that reacts faster than your enemies instead of the other way around. Also, Sony have very kindly offered to sponsor this video, so I'll be showcasing a lot of today's recommendations on a Sony Bravia XR A90K TV. Where am I going to get one of those, you ask? Well, here's one I prepared earlier. I've got to be honest, I've always wanted to do that. Sony have also helped out with some insider knowledge about how the tech works so that we can create the perfect gaming experience and destroy any input lag that we've got. Before recording this video, I did a poll on Twitter, and less than half of the people that responded, who all play games on their TV, had game mode turned on. This is a crime because game mode is absolutely essential, but sadly, not all game modes are created equal. And what you may not be aware of is that there's actually a game mode on PCs as well as on consoles. So I'm going to dig into the detail here so that you can create the perfect build for your setup. So what is game mode and how do we make sure that it's being applied correctly? Normally, your screen is trying to balance two different things. On the one hand, you've got the input delay of your screen. That's the amount of time it takes to process the picture before it can deliver it to you. And on the other hand, you've got the picture quality, the smoothness, the clarity of it all. And obviously, the more effects that you apply to make the picture better mean that it takes longer to get the picture to your eyeballs. Game mode recognizes this and strips away all of the unnecessary post-processing, so you just get the image that's being outputted by your console with as little input delay as possible, so that your responses on your controller are lightning fast and they instantly happen in the game. The problem is, some older monitors and TVs don't apply it properly, or what they do is just ineffective. And so you may have turned game mode on, but there may be other settings that you still need to turn off in order to try and bring your input delay down. The nice thing about the A90K is that Sony obviously make PlayStation 5s as well as TVs, so they know what the optimal settings are for gaming, and the reduction in input lag from other modes like cinema mode, for example, to game mode is insane. Here's an example where I'm just flicking through the menus and you can see how much delay there is in cinema mode. Then I switch to game mode and the delay is clearly massively reduced. An even better example might be in game. As you can see here, I'm shooting on my trigger, but the bullet is so delayed coming out of my gun because of the input delay in cinema mode. However, you switch to game mode and the delay is nearly non-existent. There's always a little bit of delay, and that's because the PS5 takes time to process your input as well, but it's a huge reduction. We're talking going from 150 plus milliseconds of delay outside of game mode to only 8.5 milliseconds of delay with game mode turned on. That's 8 thousandths of a second, a minuscule number. And for a screen this big as well, this is a 48-inch, that is an incredibly quick response time. Now, if you're trying to figure out where your PC's game mode is, go to your settings, type in game mode, and turn it on. On this exact same page, I also recommend you go to the graphics settings option in the top right and experiment with whether hardware-accelerated GPU scheduling is good for your system or not. In some cases on Modern Warfare 2 with the new patch, this does cause some stuttering, so a lot of people like turning this off, but test it on your system because you may prefer it to be switched on. Bear in mind also that if you're going to toggle this, you will need to restart your PC in between. Next, pull up your NVIDIA control panel, go to the Manage 3D Settings page, and just copy all these settings. I've listed them this way because they'll look slightly different depending on what drivers you've got and what graphics card you've got, but you definitely want to make sure that you turn on low latency mode and your shader cache size is maxed out. Next up, you want to maximize your screen's refresh rate. In your PS5 settings, go to Screen and Video, and then scroll down to 120 Hz output and turn that on. Hertz is the unit per second, so this just means 120 times per second. Your screen's just going to be refreshing that much faster. And then in the Modern Warfare 2 settings, you need to enable 120 Hz refresh rate, and with both of those turned on, your game's refresh rate will be doubled. Except, this is only going to work if your screen, your TV or your monitor, can actually display a 120 Hz signal. With the A90K, it's smart enough to be able to detect that input, so it just automatically switches to it, but you may need to specify in your screen settings settings that you actually want it to run at 120 Hz. Now, some screens don't support 120, but you can overclock to get up to 120. And that might be offered within the menus of the screen, or you might have to look up some YouTube tutorials because you kind of have to hack it. The difference this makes is so insane. I can't tell you how buttery everything feels once you move into 120 FPS. Like, people say stuff about the human eye not being able to see above 60. Wrong. Butter is what you're going to be feeling as you cut through those enemies. Butter. If you're on Xbox, there is a similar setting. You're going to want to go to Profile and System, Settings, General, and then TV and Display options, and there's a 120 Hz refresh rate option in there. Now, a pro tip for some older screens, if you've got a lot of input delay on your TV, you might find that changing your video mode also makes a difference. You've got to be careful with this one because it can affect your colors, but with L, for instance, allowing YCC422 meant that their input delay was much reduced. The same kind of adjustments might work on a PlayStation as well. It just depends what your screen is. So obviously give this a little test, experiment with it, and see what works for you. It just goes to show that game mode is not the only setting you need to tweak on your screen in order to get the best possible experience. Now, while doing that stuff, you might have noticed a setting for auto low latency mode. This is enabled by HDMI 2.1, and the A90K automatically enables it. So you're just good to go with auto low latency mode, no questions asked. However, if you don't have HDMI 2.1, you may not be able to get it, but game mode is still going to be pretty much just as good in most scenarios. ALLM is just basically an automatic version. However, ALLM doesn't give you any granularity within the game mode. So even though my A90K just wants to turn it on because it's available to me, I manually choose ALLM off and game mode on, and then I go into the game mode settings and tweak those one by one. Specifically, Sony has tested all of the post-processing effects and general features of the A90K to understand what contributes what amount to the input delay. And they found that one of their sharpening features doesn't contribute in a meaningful way to the input delay, and so they've left it switched on, but just on a low setting. You can see it right here, and this is going to mean that your game is going to look more crisp than it otherwise would. Your screen might have done a similar thing. It might have left certain processing effects on despite game mode being switched on. But in your case, they could still be contributing to input delay. Luckily, I have a little trick that you could use here to keep that sharpening benefit, but completely remove any input delay from the system. In Modern Warfare 2 and in Warzone, you're actually given a sharpening option. So what you could do is go into the settings here, turn any sharpening effects on your screen off, and then go into the game settings and just bump the sharpening up in the game. And that way, your console is the thing doing the hard work, and the load on your TV is absolutely minimized. Another option that you might need to check for, or rather uncheck in your screen's settings, is any kind of motion smoothing. This one's really deceptive. It sounds like something you would want enabled because motion smoothing sounds like increasing your frame rate to make it smoother. And technically, it is kind of doing that, but the problem is that smoothing is done via frame interpolation and frame insertion. What that means is the game is still outputting the same number of frames, but the screen is guessing what might go in between in order to connect the dots, basically. And this means that it's actually giving you a false representation of the game's output. It might look incredible in a racing game, potentially, where there's no fast twitch movements, it's not constantly changing, it's not constantly altering what's in front of you, you're just kind of gliding down a track. And it's definitely really effective if you're watching sports or things like that. Like, that's what it's designed for. But if you're playing a shooter, you need that smoothing off, because as soon as you abruptly change direction, the interpolation is going to get it wrong, and it's going to mean that you're actually a frame late to reacting to whatever it is that you're trying to react to. It'll have basically baited you, so turn it off. While you're doing this, have a comb through your picture settings to check if there are any other post-processing effects that have been kept on in game mode, and try essentially turning all of them off to see if it makes a difference to your particular screen. Now, the A90K also supports HDR. Your screen may or may not, and I personally always recommend turning HDR on. If you're in a scene, let's say you're on Al Mazrah, and there's some bright sunlight, but then there's also a dark, shadowy room, for example, and it's in the same frame. Your eye is going to naturally be able to understand the visual data of the brightness and the dark much better with HDR, because there is more bandwidth of brightness over which the image can be displayed. It's not trying to cram it all in to all look like one color, one tone, one contrast, one brightness. And so that expanded bandwidth is going to mean that you can react react faster to it because you're going to do less cognitive processing in order to understand the image and react. If you are turning on HDR, make sure you've also enabled the HDR checkbox in the Modern Warfare 2 settings. Sony boosts the HDR and also just the tone and color using this thing called XR OLED Contrast Pro, and it has this whole cognitive processor that handles all that stuff so that the image is optimized. And a lot of that gets turned off in game mode, but again, similar to the reality creation super resolution option, some of that processing is still turned on when game mode is active because Sony have found that it obviously makes a massive difference to the picture quality. It enhances what you're able to see in any given game, but it doesn't affect your input lag. So they're eking out those little percentage gains that all contribute to you having an advantage. However, once again, not all HDRs and not all screens are created equal. And on some screens, turning on HDR is going to mean that the contrast looks weird, the colors go funky, they look really desaturated, and your visual clarity is actually really reduced. So while I do recommend turning it on, and especially if you've got an A90K, it's only going to enhance your picture quality. On your screen, if it does look awful, don't just blindly follow my advice to turn it on because your screen might just not be up to the task. Now, in the game, you also have a stack of features that interface with the things I've already talked about to either reduce delay or make your game clearer so that you can react faster. Let's run through a couple of general options first, and then we'll go console and PC. Number 1, motion blur. Turn it off. If you're considering motion blur in a first-person shooter, I'm sorry, but you're out of your mind. I did another poll on this, and it looks like you don't want to be on the other end of these results. The same goes for film grain. Turn it off. Unnecessary visual noise that's going to interrupt your brain understanding the picture. Also, turn depth of field off. You just don't want to blur your screen voluntarily in a shooter. It's just a bad idea. And that brings us to sharpening. Now, on console, you have this Fidelity FX CAS option. That's contrast adaptive sharpening. I like this pretty damn high personally. So the general recommendation is usually around 75. I like it on 100. It's personal preference though, but I definitely recommend turning it on because it's going to mean that your entire image, that entire frame is more clear. This also means that if you hate Fidelity FX CAS, which is what the console gives you, you can in theory just put the workload back on the TV if the way that they apply super resolution on the A90K, for instance, is much more preferable to you. It's a preference thing. This is giving you more choice. On PC, you still have access to Fidelity FX CAS, so you're welcome to do the same thing that you did on console, or if you've got a higher end graphics card like a 20, 30, or 40 series NVIDIA card, I recommend DLSS. And I think the default is for it to be balanced and at about 82%. Once you've turned it on, I'd say experiment to find an image with visual clarity that suits your preference the best. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all answer here. It depends how your eye interprets the frame, really. If you do stick with Fidelity FX, you're going to have options for anti-aliasing and the quality of it. And this one's a deceptive one because you might think that you want maxed out anti-aliasing, but you may find that you want to take a leaf out of the Counter-Strike Pros books and just turn your anti-aliasing down to low. And that's going to mean that the edges of things are mega jagged, but there'll be no approximation of what the diagonal line is. And for a game like CS, that's really important. Less so in COD, but it might be worth a try if you're the sort of person that's trying to get that 0.1% advantage over other people and you're a pixel peeper. Now, to further enhance your visuals on both console and PC, you can change your colors. This sounds really simple, but believe me, this makes such a big difference and so many people have just missed it. So go into the color options here, select filter 2. You'll see how much of a difference it makes going from none to filter 2. Select both so that it's not just the HUD or the world, but it's actually both of them that are getting enhanced here, and turn the intensity up to 100. Now, an old trick that people have been using since as long as I can remember really with COD is you could also turn on the colorblind settings, even if you're not colorblind, just because they might give you a color format that you prefer. A really popular one is the Tritonopia setting. How do you pronounce that word? I don't really know. But tab through all of them and see which one suits you the best. Now then, field of view is a controversial one because ever since they added an FOV slider, a lot of people just think that the max FOV must be the best. But there's a trade-off here that a lot of people don't realize. So on the one hand, a wider FOV is going to mean that you feel like you've got more vision to your sides when you're playing. However, it is also going to mean that what's in the center of your screen feels further away. If you compare this to a low FOV, you won't have that peripheral vision, but that means that you're basically tunneling on that center of the frame. And so all of the stuff that's in there is going to be a lot more clear. So if you go all the way to 120 FOV, it's actually going to affect the way you aim because you're going to have to be much more precise over a smaller area of the screen when you're in the center trying to aim at targets. For this reason, I used to play about 105 FOV, but I've actually dropped it now to about 95 in Warzone and DMZ because it gives me the balance that I'm looking for of a little bit of peripheral vision above what I'd normally get on a console, but I'm still zoomed in enough so that I can perfectly track people with complete visual clarity. I also strongly recommend going into the show more settings here and turning ADS field of view onto affected. This way you're not going to pop when you zoom in and pop when you zoom out again. Most people should also probably turn on-demand texture streaming off. I've got gigabit internet, so I leave it on. It isn't a big deal for me, but you don't really want to be downloading textures while you play. You want all of your internet bandwidth to just be available for the game to use. For your controller, there are two main settings that I think are essential that you focus on. One is just turning controller vibration off. The more movement in your hands, the less likely you are to be able to be precise on your thumbsticks. And in the advanced menu, I'd recommend either default or black ops for your aim assist type, and personally I prefer standard as your aim response curve type. Play with those settings though, don't mess around with the other settings too much for now, but play with those first, see what feels good for you. Then, once you've decided how you like it, don't tweak anything else apart from your input's dead zone. Specifically, you want your left stick min and right stick min as low as possible. If you set this too low and your controller's a little bit busted, you're going to end up with stick drift, so you'll be standing still, but your character will just rotate all on their own while you aren't even holding the stick. But if you find the sweet spot for your controller, it'll mean that a smaller movement of the stick will cause your character to start moving, so that will also mean that any input time is reduced because you spend less time getting the stick to the point of actually activating a response in the game. You can play around with the other dead zone options here as well, but start with left stick min and right stick min because those are really the core of what you're tweaking here. Now for some quick fire recommendations. Your display mode should be full screen. Experiment with increasing your video memory scale, but leave it on default if it causes issues. Everything in details and textures you can afford to turn down in order to increase your performance because it's not really going to affect your gameplay, it's just how nice things look. And terrain memory is an especially deceiving one because it sounds like you should have that maxed, but you can actually afford to turn that right the way down to minimum. Everything in shadow and lighting you can turn down as well, and this will really improve any hitching or stuttering that you might be having, but you're going to want to max out your spot cache. This is reliant on you having a decent amount of VRAM in your system, so if you've got a really old GPU, you might want to just leave this a couple settings lower, but if you've got a decent card, more spot cache is definitely going to work to your advantage. Finally, NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, turn that on, and even turn it onto on plus boost to reduce your input lag on PC even further. Combined with the massive input delay reduction that the A90K is also able to provide with game mode, and with all the other optimizations that that TV is doing, or that your screen may be doing as well, depending on your settings, you should now have an incredibly responsive game. And seeing as, like I said in that poll, 50% of people don't even have game mode turned on, you should now have a significant advantage over your competition. Once you're happy with your settings on PC, there's one last thing to remember, and that's to just go back into your display tab, restart your shaders optimization, wait for it to finish, and then quit your game and restart your PC. Let me know in the comments if this video has been useful, and like I said, it's been sponsored by Sony, and if you're interested in getting one of these TVs, an A90K, there's a link in the description where you can click through and purchase. I'm really appreciative that they reached out to work with me on this content, so thank you Sony, thank you for watching, I'll see you next time, bye for now.